I filed the dispatch at 3:17 station time and poured myself a second cup of bad coffee and did not think about it again for 6 months. That is not negligence. That is overnight watch at Frontier Monitoring Station Ledge 9, which sits at the trailing edge of the pre-diaspora survey corridor, beyond the last active relay node, and about as far from anything scheduled or expected as a posting can be while still technically being a posting. Ledge 9 has a complement of 6 communications officers on rotating shift and Station Commander Rellies, who has been here longer than any of us, and who speaks about that fact in the way that people speak about things they have made their peace with. We monitor. We log. We forward the things that require forwarding and archive the things that do not, and most things do not. And the overnight shift in particular is a long sequence of quiet hours in which the universe demonstrates, in careful detail, that it has nothing urgent to say to us. I have been on overnight watch at this station, on and off, for 11 years. In that time I have called Commander Rellies at home exactly twice. The first time was when a misfired deep field calibration pulse from a consortium navigation array made my instruments believe, briefly and incorrectly, that a small moon was on an intercept course with the station. I called Rellies. Rellies called the consortium. The consortium corrected the calibration. The moon was a software ghost that had never existed, and the correction took 12 minutes. That was 7 years ago, and the calibration incident remains, in the institutional memory of this station, the most dramatic thing that happened during my overnight watches. The second time I called Rellies was 6 months after the signal. But I am getting ahead of the sequence of events, and the sequence of events is the part that matters, and I want to describe it properly. The signal deserves a proper description. It is an unusual signal, and the unusualness of it, the specific, improbable, administrative nature of its unusualness, is the reason I am writing this account rather than submitting a standard after-action form and going home. Ledge 9 monitors, among other things, a band of frequencies that nobody uses anymore. The pre-diaspora collision warning spectrum runs from the low end of what the expansion-era survey fleets called the long-haul emergency range down through several subbands that those fleets wired into their distress beacons, their wreck notification systems, and their automated hull loss certification units. The spectrum is old in the way that institutional infrastructure becomes old when it outlasts the institutions that created it. Not through a single moment of obsolescence, but through the slow accumulation of newer systems that grow alongside it rather than replacing it, until one day the newer systems have been running long enough that the people who know why the old ones are still in the monitoring table have mostly retired, and the people who remain inherit the configuration without inheriting the explanation for it. The pre-diaspora collision warning spectrum is still in Ledge 9's sweep table because removing it requires a formal spectrum decommission review, and the spectrum decommission review has been pending before the appropriate oversight committee for 9 years, and the oversight committee has not scheduled the meeting. This is not a scandal. This is administration. The committee has other priorities and limited meeting slots, and the spectrum has not been causing any problems, which in institutional logic means it ranks below the things that are causing problems, which is a reasonable way to prioritize, and which has the side effect of creating a monitoring station that sweeps dead frequencies indefinitely while the world waits for bureaucratic calendars to align. Every 40 minutes, Ledge 9's monitoring array runs a pass across frequencies that haven't carried genuine traffic in 140 years, logs the result as nominal, and moves on. It has done this for as long as I have been here, and I expect it will continue doing it until the meeting is scheduled, which I have stopped trying to predict. At 3:14 on the 17th of March, the pass came back not nominal. The burst was 22 seconds long, type beam, encoded to a specific format, clearly structured, not the random noise you get from background radiation or the occasional low-amplitude bleed from navigation equipment operating in the corridor. This was intentional transmission. Someone, somewhere, at some point, had built a machine to do this specific thing on this specific frequency, and the machine had done it. The signal analysis library flagged it within 39 seconds of the pass completing. The flag identified the format as Varethi Fleet Administration, specifically the subtype recorded in the pre-expansion translation tables as hull loss notification, automated transmission, single discharge. The translation note attached to the flag was written in the slightly formal prose of first contact documentation, the kind of language that accumulates in archival systems from periods when contact with a new civilization was recent enough to feel significant and formal protocols were still being established. It read, Varethi Fleet Administration requires by law the attachment of a hull loss notification beacon to every registered Varethi vessel. Upon confirmed hull loss, the beacon activates and broadcasts vessel identification, last known coordinates, and certification of loss to Varethi Fleet Administration headquarters. The beacon is designed to broadcast immediately upon hull loss, but in cases of deep field loss or power interruption, the beacon may delay broadcast until sufficient charge is recovered from its long-term battery cell. Broadcast frequency is encoded to Varethi Fleet Administration receiving standards. Crossband interference with human emergency frequencies has been observed in legacy beacon models due to encoding overlap with pre-expansion Terran survey systems. This translation entry is archived from pre-expansion contact period. Varethi Fleet Administration is no longer an active interlocutor. That last line earned a second read. A not active interlocutor institution is not generally in the business of signaling us, even through automated systems, and the phrase flagged something in my mind that I wanted to address before I decided how to proceed. I decoded the beacon's internal timestamp. The signal analysis library had flagged an anomaly in it, labeled temporal discrepancy, magnitude significant. The timestamp encoded two dates, the date of the original hull loss and the date of the broadcast transmission. I ran the timestamp through the secondary verification routine. Then I opened the raw signal data and read the timestamp field character by character, because that is not how anyone is supposed to verify a timestamp, but it is how I verify timestamps when a result seems implausible, and I want to remove the possibility that I am reading an artifact of the translation process. It was not an artifact. The hull loss date was 214 years, 3 months, and 11 days before the date on my terminal. The broadcast date was today. I sat with this for longer than I usually sit with things during the overnight shift. The interpretation was not complicated, once you accepted the numbers. The beacon had been installed on a vessel that was lost 214 years ago, in a location deep enough in the survey corridor's dead zone that the beacon's immediate broadcast capacity had never charged sufficiently to fire. In the years since the hull loss, the beacon's long-term battery cell had been accumulating charge, slowly, from whatever ambient energy source was available to it, thermal gradient or residual radiation, or the slow trickle that such cells are designed to harvest from their environment when nothing else is available. When the charge reached sufficient capacity, the beacon broadcast its notification. After 214 years, the signal was addressed to the Varethi Fleet Administration. The Varethi Fleet Administration had not been an active institution for at least a century. The signal had ended up on the pre-diaspora collision warning band because of an encoding overlap between legacy Varethi beacon formats and pre-expansion Terran survey systems, an overlap that predated formal contact between our civilizations, and that the beacon's designers had been unaware of, because they had never heard of Leg 9 or its monitoring array or the oversight committee that had not scheduled the decommission review. The signal was aimed at an institution that was gone. It arrived at a station that was listening to a dead frequency because of a meeting nobody had booked. My standing orders for the collision warning band are explicit. Any signal flagged as a potential hull event in the pre-diaspora survey corridor, regardless of origin, regardless of age, requires a standard collision hazard response. Log the event. Compute a probable site position based on signal propagation and the beacon's encoded origin coordinates. Dispatch a Terran Commonwealth autonomous response drone to verify the site presents no active navigation hazard and to document the debris field for the corridor survey record. The standing orders were written primarily to handle the scenario where an old wreck has drifted into or near a navigation corridor and poses a physical hazard. They were not written with 214-year-old administrative beacon broadcasts in mind. They covered this situation anyway, because standing orders written for a monitoring station at the edge of a long derelict survey corridor are written broadly, and the people who wrote them had the wisdom to write them broadly. I computed the site position. The beacon's encoded origin coordinates, adjusted for signal propagation time at standard lightspeed transmission, put the site at 11 light months out from the station, deep in the dead zone, a stretch of the survey corridor defined primarily by the complete absence of anything in it, which is why it is called the dead zone and why the corridor routes around it rather than through it. Nothing transits the dead zone. There is no reason to. There is nothing there to transit toward. I filed the dispatch at 3:17. Standard priority, not emergency. A 214-year-old bureaucratic notification is not an emergency by any framework I have been trained in. I logged the drone's departure window at 3:40. The round-trip transit time at standard autonomous cruise I calculated would be approximately 5 months and 3 weeks, depending on the complexity of the site survey. I noted this in my log. Then I submitted my after-action note to the standard queue and poured my second cup of coffee and worked through the rest of the overnight items, which were routine, and went home when day shift arrived. I told no one what the dispatch was for. There was nothing to tell. A monitoring station had detected a signal on a dead band and dispatched a drone to check the site. That is what monitoring stations do. The drone would go and come back with a wreck report, and I would log the wreck report, and the corridor survey record would be updated with one more debris field entry. I expected an unexceptional outcome, and I had no reason to expect otherwise. I did not think about it again for 6 months. The drone came back on a Thursday in mid-September. I was on day shift by then. I had rotated out of overnight in April, which I regard as a mercy, because overnight is good for thinking and bad for everything else. And it was Torev who flagged the return in the morning queue and forwarded it to my terminal at 9:47 with a note that said, "Your March dispatch is back. Looks like it has a secondary package." I opened the file at 10:22 and found the standard site survey components. Exterior photography of the debris field, composition analysis of the hull material, navigation hazard assessment with result none, the wreck being deep enough in the dead zone that it posed no realistic risk to any plausible navigation corridor, and a secondary events folder. The secondary events folder was substantially larger than any secondary events folder I have received from an autonomous drone in 11 years at this station. It contained a 47-minute audio file in Varethi language with an auto-generated translation flag attached. It contained 312 still images from the drone's documentation array, far more than a standard debris field survey generates. It contained an autonomy incident log that ran to 19 pages, which I want to note is exceptional because standard autonomous response drones generate site survey logs of 2 to 4 pages, and I had not previously seen a 19-page version. And it contained a cover note from the drone's autonomy system in the flat, unadorned machine-generated prose that autonomous systems produce when they have encountered a situation their primary category library did not anticipate. Secondary event detected at site. Site not uninhabited at time of survey. Survivors present 6 individuals, Varethi species, crew of disabled survey runner Edorath margin. Survivors located in sealed interior section of wreck structure. Life support maintained via emergency cells connected to wreck's aft service port. Established limited bandwidth contact via signal protocol adaptation. Survivors confirmed understanding of contact. Administered medical triage package per standing humanitarian protocol, Section 14B. Deployed emergency power cell array from primary cargo pod. Deployed emergency communications relay module from secondary storage bay. Recorded recipient message per protocol Section 14B, Roman 4. All available cargo deployed. Returned per original mission timeline. Recommending review of secondary events protocol for future survivor contact scenarios, specifically regarding expanded cargo options for inhabited site surveys. I read the cover note. I read it again. I became aware without turning around that Torev was standing behind my left shoulder reading it over my head. I said, "Get me Commander Rellies." He was already reaching for the comm panel. Then I started the 47-minute audio file. Her name was Saveth Kelm. She gave it clearly at the beginning of the recording twice, with a measured pause between repetitions. The translation system rendered her title as Expedition Leader, and flagged this as an approximation, noting that the Varethi original carried connotations combining senior navigator, accountable officer, and primary record keeper, for which English has no single clean equivalent. She identified her crew by name and role, 6 people, the complete crew of the survey runner Edorath Margin, contracted to the Rethaven Cartographic Consortium for deep corridor mapping work. She gave the names in the order that her crew were seated in the sealed section when she recorded the message, and she noted that this was a Varethi convention for establishing, on the record, that all listed individuals were present and responsive. The list was complete. Then she described what had happened. The Edorath Margin was a small, fast survey runner, 7 years in service, well maintained by an organization that ran its equipment hard because deep corridor mapping is expensive and margins are narrow. It was optimized for speed and fuel efficiency rather than redundancy, which is a reasonable design choice for the kind of work it was built for, and which had the consequence that when a single critical component failed, the failure was total rather than partial. The component was a stress regulation coupling in the primary drive's fuel feed assembly. The manufacturing tolerance on this coupling, according to the manufacturer's documentation, provided for a certain operational lifetime under the load conditions typical of deep corridor survey work. The actual operational lifetime turned out to be shorter than the documented one by a margin sufficient to matter. The consortium's maintenance schedule had been built around the documented lifetime. The coupling had been accumulating fatigue below the detection threshold of routine inspections, quietly, for the last year of its service life, and it failed completely and without warning on day 6 of the Edorath Margin's current survey run. The drive failure cascaded through the power distribution system and took the secondary communications array with it. Life support and internal power survived intact on the emergency cells. Navigation, propulsion, and external communications did not survive. Saveth had estimated life support duration at 11 days, with conservative consumption management. She had no propulsion and no way to call for help, and 11 days in which to find an alternative. Passive sensors, which ran on minimal power draw from the emergency cells, picked up a structural mass on day 11. The mass was approximately 9 light hours ahead of the Edorath Margin's drifting position, and it was in a direction that was marginally toward the nearest relay node, which was an irrelevant fact given that they could not reach the relay node in any case, but which Saveth noted in her account anyway because the coincidence seemed worth recording. She had her navigator run the intercept calculation. The emergency positioning thrusters, not designed for transit, designed for station keeping and minor course adjustments, capable of accumulating meaningful velocity if run for an extended period at reduced capacity, could reach the mass in approximately 10 days if managed carefully. Saveth ran the thrusters at 30% of their rated capacity, continuously, for 9 days and 16 hours. She did not push them harder because she was not certain of their condition, and she could not afford to lose them. She reduced the environmental temperature in the crew section by 3 degrees Celsius, which bought additional cell capacity at the cost of comfort, and she decided that comfort was a reasonable thing to sacrifice. She rotated her crew through sleep shifts to ensure everyone remained rested, because a rested crew makes better decisions, and she anticipated needing good decisions. She had every crew member catalog the Edorath Margin's equipment, every piece of it, from the obvious to the trivial, and document potential alternative applications for each item, because this was the kind of methodical work that occupied the mind productively when there was nothing more immediately useful to do. She used the word methodical when she described this period, and she used it without irony. Methodical work, she said, is what holds a crew together when there is nothing else holding them. The mass was a wreck. She identified it as Varethi construction from the exterior markings, the hull geometry, and the general design language, though the specific registration format was archaic enough that she could not match it to any database she had access to. The wreck was large. She estimated a heavy transport or deep exploration vessel based on its dimensions, and large enough that certain sections of its interior retained structural integrity sufficient to shelter in. Not comfortable. Not sealed, potentially survivable with work. On day 21, she moved her crew in. They brought every piece of useful equipment from the Edorath Margin and spent 2 days sealing off a section of the wreck's interior using emergency patch material. A flexible sealant designed for hull breaches, not for large area interior reconstruction, and stretched past its designed application, but adequate when applied carefully to the specific geometry of the section they had chosen. The section they chose was a cargo transit corridor midship, sealed at both ends by bulkhead doors that still functioned, which meant they needed to patch only the damaged sections of the corridor walls rather than improvising closures from scratch. Saveth was specific about this detail, and I noted it because it illustrated the kind of decision-making she described throughout. Not luck, not desperation, but survey experience applied to an unfamiliar problem. She had assessed 6 sections of the hulk before choosing that corridor. She chose it because the bulkhead doors worked. They rigged the runner's surviving emergency cells to supply life support power through a connection at the wreck's aft service port. They mapped the interior of their sealed section thoroughly, cataloged what it contained, identified every potential resource, and established what Saveth called a minimally acceptable stable environment, which was her term for an environment where the 6 of them could stay alive for an indeterminate period without any of them making a decision that would end that arrangement. She described the wreck's interior briefly in the recording, the way the air smelled in the sealed section, which was the stale, recycled smell that emergency life support always produces, but with an undertone she described as very old and very still, like a room that had been closed for longer than anyone could count. The way the emergency lighting threw everything into a particular quality of flatness that her crew had learned to navigate by feel as much as by sight. The sounds the hull made, not random. She had cataloged them carefully over the first 2 weeks and established which were structural, and which were thermal, and which were simply the particular vocabulary of this wreck settling into its equilibrium with the local temperature gradients. She knew the sounds the way she knew the sounds of her own ships. She had made it hers, in the way that people make environments theirs when they have no alternative. She described day 38, unprompted in the middle of a passage about something else. She said day 38 was when she had sat alone in the forward section of the corridor during her off-watch and understood, clearly and without distress, that the most likely outcome of their situation was that no one would come. She had not told her crew this. She had sat with it for the duration of her off-watch, and then she had gone back to work. She said she mentioned it not for emotional effect, but because she thought the record of a situation like this should include the moments when the person keeping the record had looked at the situation clearly, because the clear-eyed moments are part of the record as much as the decisions made from them, and because the decision she made after day 38, to continue managing the cells precisely, to continue the cataloging work, to continue sleeping in rotation and keeping the crew oriented, was a decision she had made knowing what she knew on day 38, and she wanted that context in the record. I found this portion of the recording the most difficult to set down after the first listening, not because it was dramatic, it was not. It was stated plainly in the middle of a sentence in the same tone she used for the engineering details. The difficulty was in that tone, the plainness of it. They sent 3 distress calls in the conventional manner, using the Edorath Margins Emergency Radio Unit. The first call went on day 22. The second on day 29, when the first had produced no response. The third on day 37, when the second had also produced no response. After the third call, the emergency radio unit's own cells were depleted, and Savath chose not to attempt to recharge them from the main cell array, because the main cells were providing life support, and she was not willing to reduce their capacity. No response came to any of the 3 calls, because the dead zone is called that for a reason. There are no relay nodes within range. There are no navigation buoys. There is no monitoring infrastructure of any kind, human or otherwise, that might receive a standard emergency transmission. The dead zone is called that because nothing goes there and nothing watches it, and the signals that go out into it go out and keep going until they attenuate into background noise. Saveth had known this before she moved her crew into the wreck. She sent the calls anyway, because the cost of 3 calls was low and the possibility, however small, was real. Saveth said in the recording that she had understood this from the beginning. She had known when she chose the wreck as their shelter that conventional rescue was unlikely. She had made the choice anyway because the alternative, remaining on the Edorath margin with failing cells and no shelter, was not survivable on any timeline. The wreck extended their timeline. Extended timelines provide opportunities that fixed timelines do not. She had decided to take the extended timeline and see what opportunities it produced. This is not, in my reading of the account, optimism. Optimism is a disposition. What Saveth describes is a decision, made from the available information, with clear-eyed understanding of what the decision could and could not provide. It is a different thing, and the difference matters, and I want it to be clear in this account which of those 2 things it was. They had been in the wreck for 73 days when the drone arrived. Saveth's description of the drone's arrival is the portion of the recording I played 3 times. I want to be honest about why. Not because I needed to hear it again for comprehension, because the first listening was clear, but because I found that on the first playing I kept pausing it to sit with what she had said. The second and third playings let me hear it without stopping. She heard it first, a sound that was exterior to the hull, not the structural settlement sound she had cataloged and classified and learned to predict in the first 2 weeks, not the periodic thermal cycling of the outer skin, but something different. Something that moved and repeated with a pattern that was deliberate rather than mechanical. She woke the crew member on watch and told her to seal the intersection. Then she went to the aft observation port herself. She looked through the port glass. A Terran Commonwealth Autonomous Response Drone, Class 7, was conducting a methodical exterior survey of the wreck's hull. She said she recognized it. Anyone who worked the deep survey corridor knew Commonwealth equipment from its markings and its silhouette and the configuration of its sensor arrays. She had not expected to see Commonwealth equipment in the dead zone. 73 days into an emergency, she had arrived at a quiet understanding might not resolve itself. She stood at the port and watched the drone move along the hull, deliberate, unhurried, working systematically through its documentation sweep, and she processed the fact of it. She said her mind did not immediately accept it as real. She had cataloged, over the preceding weeks, a number of moments in which her visual system had attempted to assemble meaningful patterns from insufficient data, and she had developed a habit of pausing before acting on visual information to verify it through a second sense or a second look. She pressed her hand against the port glass. Cold, she noted. The glass was always cold, and watched the drone complete a section of its exterior sweep and reposition for the next, and she confirmed to herself that it was there, and that it was doing what it appeared to be doing. The word that came to her, she said, was thorough. In her own language, the drone was thorough. It was doing a thorough, unhurried, careful job of documenting the exterior of a wreck that it had come to survey, and it had not yet noticed that the wreck had people in it. She stood at the port and worked through the chain of reasoning. For minutes, she said, she had timed herself by counting, which was her habit when she needed to think carefully. The drone was there. Drones are sent. Someone had sent it. They had sent it because they had received a signal. The signal could not have come from her team, whose communications equipment had been exhausted on day 66. The wreck's only identifiable automated system was the hull loss notification beacon she had found in the aft storage bay on day 8 during her resource survey. She had noted it as a Varethi Fleet Administration unit, archaic, with no active institution to receive its notification, and she had set it aside as irrelevant because it had appeared completely inert and because she had other things to do. She had been wrong about the inert part. She worked through the implication. The beacon had been accumulating charge in its long-term cell for 214 years, and it had finally had enough power to broadcast, and it had broadcast on some frequency that someone was monitoring, and that someone had dispatched this drone to check on the wreck. And the drone was here, 43 light months from Ledge 9, doing its sweep, approximately 60 meters from where Saveth Kelm was standing with her hand on cold glass. She said the word that came to her at the end of those 4 minutes was not thorough anymore. She did not provide a translation equivalent. She said the matrix would not carry it correctly, and she preferred to leave it unnamed in the record. Then she went and got her emergency signaling kit. She used every component. Reflective panels positioned in the aft section to give the drone's visual sensors the strongest possible return. The acoustic signaling unit, which operated on frequencies she did not know whether a Class 7 drone covered, but which she activated regardless because she was using everything she had. She positioned herself in the most visible location in the aft section, near the port, and she had her crew member on watch ready to open the aft access hatch on her instruction. She did everything she could think of to make herself visible to a machine whose specific sensor configuration she did not know, in a situation she had not prepared for, after 73 days of waiting for something that had not come. The drone turned toward her after completing its current survey section. Approximately 90 seconds elapsed between the drone's reorientation and its movement toward her. She said 90 seconds was a long time to stand in front of a machine and wait for its autonomy system to categorize what it was seeing. She counted, I think she counted to 90. The drone moved toward her. She instructed her crew member to open the hatch. The drone's 19-page incident log described what happened next with the systematic clarity that automated systems apply to everything equally, without distinguishing between the routine and the significant, except by allocating more log entries to the latter. The life sign detection had triggered a mission parameter review. The autonomy system had compared its primary mission objective, document the debris field, assess navigation hazard, return against Section 14B of the Humanitarian Protocol, which states that any Commonwealth autonomous unit detecting survivors at a survey site is required to administer available emergency resources regardless of the circumstances of the original dispatch. The review had taken 23 seconds. The result was that Section 14B superseded the primary mission, and the drone was to assist. The medical triage kit was deployed first. 2 crew members had infections. One was moderate. One was serious enough that Saveth had been, in her own words in the recording, genuinely concerned for that crew member's survival over the preceding 2 weeks. The drone's medical assessment unit, a briefcase-sized subsystem capable of diagnostic scanning and auto-dispensing from a standardized emergency pharmacopoeia, evaluated both cases and dispensed treatment appropriate to each. The log described the treatments in clinical specificity. I read the clinical description carefully. Commander Rellies read it later, and he set the page down for a moment after finishing it and did not say anything, which is, in my experience of Commander Rellies, a form of comment. The emergency power cell array was deployed from the primary cargo pod. 6 cells, each rated at 400 hours of life support capacity at crew of 6 density. Saveth's main cells were at 18%, and declining at a rate she had calculated would leave them with approximately 11 days of capacity remaining. The new cells extended the survival window by 62 days. The incident log noted this calculation precisely, as autonomous systems do. It did not note what the difference between 11 days and 62 plus 11 days meant to 6 people in a dead Hulk. Saveth's recording noted it. She noted it once, in the middle of a sentence that was otherwise about the deployment sequence, in a tone that the translation system flagged as requiring cultural context to interpret correctly. I read the translation note. I chose not to include that part of the recording in my summary report. It is in the full attachment, and it is accurate, and anyone who reads the full attachment will understand what 11 days had meant to her by the time the drone arrived. The emergency communications relay module was deployed from the drone's secondary storage bay. I want to record honestly that I had not thought about the relay module when I filed the dispatch, because relay modules are for scenarios involving survivors, and I had not anticipated a survivor scenario. The module was listed in the equipment manifest, and I had read the manifest, and the module had not been what I was focused on. The drone's autonomy system had read the manifest differently, because an autonomous system making a humanitarian assessment reads all applicable items rather than the ones relevant to the expected scenario. It deployed the module because the module was applicable. With the relay module and the new power cells, Saveth's team could broadcast a distress call at amplitude sufficient to reach the nearest relay node, 22 light days distant. The Rathavan Cartographic Consortium's search and rescue operations were not in the dead zone, and they were not monitoring the dead zone, because there was no reason to believe anyone was in the dead zone. The relay node was. A signal at the right amplitude would reach the relay node, and the relay node would forward it, and the consortium's operations center would receive it. Saveth understood this. I know she understood it because she described it in the recording, the math, the relay node, the expected propagation time, the process by which the consortium's operations would respond. She had worked the survey corridor for 9 years. She understood how the infrastructure worked. She understood in that moment what the relay module represented. The drone remained at the site for 3 days, per its standing protocol for occupied sites, to confirm the survivor situation was stable and the deployed resources were functioning as expected. It completed the remainder of its exterior survey during this period, because the mission required it, and the mission requirements did not expire when additional circumstances arose. The incident log documented all 3 days in the same systematic way it documented the arrival and the deployment, crew status, resource consumption rates, environmental readings, the drone's own power levels and sensor logs. Saveth described those 3 days briefly, in the part of the recording that came after the deployment account. She said the crew had watched the drone work through its exterior survey, and had found it, collectively, difficult to look at for long and also difficult to look away from. She said the difficulty was not because the drone was threatening. It was not, and they knew it was not, but because of what it represented, which was the fact that the universe had a larger inventory of contingency than any of them had understood when they were sitting in the dead zone, trying to determine how many days of cell capacity remained. She said one of her crew members had sat in the corridor near the aft port and watched the drone work for most of the second day, not speaking, and she had left the crew member to do this, because she thought watching the drone work was a reasonable response to what had happened. She said the drone never appeared to notice them watching. It completed each section of its survey and moved to the next with the same deliberate thoroughness regardless of whether anyone was at the port. She said she had eventually concluded that the drone's consistency was itself part of what she had been trying to name with the word thorough, that it did not perform differently when observed, that it was not doing its job for their benefit even though its job was, in this instance, their benefit, and that this distinction was harder to articulate than it seemed, but seemed important. The relay module's test broadcast on the second day confirmed the signal was reaching the nearest relay node. The drone's autonomy system logged this confirmation without commentary. On the third day, it recorded Saveth's voice message per section 14b, Roman 4, and returned. The Rithavan Cartographic Consortium's incident reports, Torev found them in the interorganizational database 3 days after the drone's return, showed a notation dated consistent with our timeline. Survey runner Edorath Margin, crew of 6, recovered from deep corridor location, all crew accounted for and in stable condition, recovery facilitated by Commonwealth Autonomous Response Resources. The notation did not elaborate. I did not elaborate for them. The recovery had happened and was complete, and the jurisdiction for the recovery itself had belonged to the consortium's own operations from the moment Saveth's relay broadcast had gone out, and I was not going to complicate a completed outcome by inserting Ledge 9 into a chain of events that had ended correctly without our further involvement. I pulled Torev away from his terminal and told him what the drone had found and what had happened, because he had flagged the return and he deserved to know the whole of it, not just the cover note summary. He listened without asking questions until I finished. Then he said, "The beacon fired after 214 years. I said yes. He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "And the committee still hasn't scheduled the meeting." I said that was correct. He nodded and went back to his terminal. He is not a man who makes unnecessary observations, and I think what he said in those 2 sentences was everything that needed to be said about the administrative dimensions of the situation. The summary was what I needed, and the summary said what I needed it to say. I wrote the after-action report summary. I attached everything: the audio file, the translation, the incident log, the images, the consortium notation, and my own contemporaneous log entries from March 17th, including the 3:17 filing timestamp and the 4-minute and 12-second processing duration, because I wanted the record to be complete in the direction of what was ordinary as well as in the direction of what was not. A record that includes only the interesting parts is not a record. It is a selection, and selections have a way of implying that the unselected parts were less real. I spent longer on the translation review than I had planned. The machine translation from the drone's log was functional, but carried the imprecision that machine translations carry when the source text does not map cleanly onto the target vocabulary. Places where Saveth had used terms in her own language for which the matrix had produced approximations, and approximations are not the same as translations. I sent the audio file to the Commonwealth Translation Service and paid the standard rate for a human-reviewed translation. This added 11 days to my timeline. I thought the 11 days were worth it, because Saveth had chosen her words carefully and had said so, and the record should carry her words as she chose them. The reviewer's notes on several passages confirmed what I had suspected. There were 3 places where the machine translation had smoothed over something the human reviewer flagged as carrying significant weight in the original, and 1 place where the machine translation had missed a tonal distinction that changed the meaning of a sentence substantially. I updated the attached translation accordingly and noted the amendments in my report. The record is, as a result, as close to what Saveth actually said as I can make it. I consider this the minimum standard for a record of this kind. I also wrote an explanation and sent it. There was no protocol requiring a response to Saveth's question. Section 14b, Roman 4, requires that the survivor's message be documented and relayed to the dispatching authority. It does not require the dispatching authority to respond. Saveth had addressed her question to whoever the drone represented through a relay module that would not carry a return signal back, and the appropriate documentation had been made. I responded anyway. She had asked a genuine question, clearly and with evident care, and I had the information to answer it, and genuine questions asked carefully seem to me to deserve answers when the information is available. I have held this view for a long time, and I do not think it requires justification. The explanation was 3 paragraphs. The first described the hull loss notification beacon, its purpose, its engineering, why a 214-year delay was consistent with the specifications of long-term battery cells in archaic Varethi beacon models, how the encoding overlap had placed the broadcast on the pre-diaspora collision warning band. The second described Ledge 9 and the legacy spectrum sweep and the 9-year pending decommission review. The third described the dispatch protocol and the drone standing humanitarian orders and the cargo it carried. I reread the explanation before sending it. It described a sequence of things that were each individually rational: a beacon charged and fired, a monitoring station was sweeping a dead band, a protocol required a dispatch, a drone carried the right equipment, the equipment did what it was designed to do. Put together, the sequence looked almost like planning. It was not planning. There was no intention anywhere in it except the distributed, accumulated intention of every person who had designed these systems and written these protocols and built these machines in the awareness that they might someday be used in exactly this kind of way. That is a kind of planning, I suppose, but it is not the kind anyone would call a decision. It is the kind that looks like coincidence from the outside and like design from the inside. And I am not sure the distinction matters as much as people sometimes think it does. I sent the explanation to Saveth through the consortium's official channel, with copies to Commander Rellies and the Sector Coordination Office. Saveth's reply arrived 6 weeks later, 9 paragraphs, addressed to me by name, which told me she had read the explanation carefully and retained more than the gist of it. The first 4 paragraphs described her experience of reading the explanation, specifically her experience of the second read, which she said had been more useful than the first. The first read had been interrupted repeatedly by the phrase, decommission review that has not been scheduled, at which her mind had kept pausing to reconstruct what that phrase implied, which was that the survival of her crew had depended in a real and specific sense on institutional inertia. She said she had a complicated professional history with institutional inertia. She worked for the Rithaven Cartographic Consortium, which she described, with what I read as fond exasperation, as an organization that had elevated the pending review to a form of institutional philosophy, and that this information had given her a new framework for evaluating that history. She said she had not yet determined whether the framework was comforting or alarming, and had concluded, provisionally, that it was both, and that this seemed like an honest response to most things. The 5th paragraph was about the word thorough. She said she had been watching the drone for 3 days, and that she had spent 6 weeks trying to name precisely what she had observed about it, because she wanted to name it correctly. The word she had arrived at was care. She said she knew this was technically imprecise as applied to a machine, and that she had considered alternative framings that were more technically accurate, and that she had returned to care anyway because the more accurate framings did not capture something that she thought was real and present in what the drone had done. She said that after 73 days in a dead hulk waiting for something that might or might not come, She had developed a heightened sensitivity to the difference between systems that merely function and systems that function in a way oriented toward the people they are functioning for, and that the drone had been the second kind of thing, and that this seemed worth recording regardless of whether a machine can be said, technically, to care. She said the methodology and the care had felt to her like the same thing. She said she did not know if that was what the engineers who built it had intended. She suspected it was. The sixth paragraph was a question. She had been thinking about old transmission systems, about what else might be broadcasting in the dead zones on frequencies that someone was still monitoring for reasons of administrative inertia or scheduled meeting failure. And she asked whether it was possible that survey records generated by teams like hers, archived in long-term databases by various consortium and government systems, might have entered pre-diaspora encoded systems. She did not want a specific answer, she said. She was asking because she had developed an acute awareness that archived information travels paths its authors did not intend, and she found she wanted to understand the paths. The seventh paragraph described 2 questions from her crew. The first was from a crew member who wanted to know the ratio of empty sites to occupied sites in Leg9's dispatch history, who understood, she said, that the probability of the drone finding anyone had been low and wanted to know how low. I answered this in my response. The drone had surveyed 17 sites in 9 years of active dispatch from Leg9, and 16 of them had been empty debris fields. The 17th was theirs. The second question she recorded without naming the crew member who had asked it. The question was, what would have happened if the beacon had taken another year to charge? If it had fired in a different month, on a different officer's watch, and the officer had decided the 214-year gap merited escalation rather than standard dispatch, and the escalation had taken 3 weeks. If the Oversight Committee had managed to schedule the decommission review 6 months before the beacon fired. She wrote the question clearly and in full and said she had no answer for it, and she was including it in the record anyway because she believed unanswerable questions had a place in records, particularly records about situations in which very specific and contingent things had to happen in a particular order for a particular outcome to obtain. I agreed with her about this. I have included the question in this account in this form for that reason. The 8th paragraph described what she had done with the beacon. She had arranged for the consortium to preserve the unit and document the REX registration data and file both with the appropriate archival authorities. She had filed a separate inquiry with the Varethi Historical Records Office, the distant, imperfect, but continuous successor to the Varethi Fleet Administration, asking for records related to the original hull loss. She said she did not know when a response would come. She said she had recalibrated her sense of what a reasonable waiting period looked like. The 9th paragraph said, I wanted to tell you what you heard since you told me what you heard, since it seems fair that you should know. What you heard was a beacon that had been waiting long enough to have something to say. I do not know if that is how it would appear in your records. It is how it seems to me from the other end of the signal. I wanted that to be in the record somewhere, written by someone who received it. I filed the formal after-action report on the 17th of September, 6 months to the day after the original dispatch. It is a complete document and I will not summarize it here. The summary is the report, and what I am writing now is something different. The recommendation in the final section of the report is simple. Continue the pre-diaspora collision warning spectrum sweep without interruption, and formally withdraw the decommission review from the Oversight Committee's pending agenda. I want to explain the recommendation in more detail than the report allows, because recommendations should be understandable to people who have not read every attachment. The case is not primarily that the spectrum produced one genuine outcome in 11 years. One outcome in 11 years is not a robust quantitative case for any resource commitment, and I am not making a quantitative case. The case is about what the dead zones contain and about what our relationship to that content should be. The survey corridor's dead zones, This one and others like it, in this sector and in others, contain an unknown number of archaic automated systems. Beacons, relay nodes that were taken offline before deactivation protocols were standard, monitoring equipment installed by early survey organizations and never recovered because recovery missions are expensive, and the equipment wasn't causing any problems. Administrative transmission units required by regulations that expired decades or centuries ago. Some were built to last. Some were built with long-term power storage, specifically because their designers anticipated situations in which the equipment might not be reachable for extended periods. Some of them have already run down, and we will never hear from them. Some of them are running on timescales that would make 214 years look brief. At any of them, at any time, there might be something, or someone, that the system was built to notify some institution about, and the institution is gone, and the signal comes out anyway onto whatever frequency it was encoded for, and the question is simply whether we have kept someone in position to hear it. I do not know what else is out there. Neither does anyone else. That is the nature of a dead zone. It is defined by the absence of knowledge about what it contains. What I know is that one signal came out of this one, on a frequency we were monitoring for administrative reasons that no longer apply, and that when it came out we heard it and we sent a drone and the drone found someone. I think that is worth something. I think it is worth more than the cost of the spectrum sweep. I think it is worth more than the time it would take the oversight committee to schedule a meeting and formally close the review, because closing the review would free up the meeting slot and retire the spectrum, and the spectrum has now demonstrated that it carries traffic that was not expected of it. I would rather keep the meeting unscheduled in this instance than hold it. Commander Rellis signed the recommendation promptly, which in my experience of Commander Rellis means he had been thinking about it before I put it on his desk. He has been at this station longer than any of us, and he has spent that time listening to things the universe says on frequencies that are, in some technical sense, no longer active. I think he understood the recommendation before he read it. I think he would have made it himself if I had not. The Oversight Committee has not yet scheduled the meeting to consider it. I have found over the past 6 months that I have developed a considerably more nuanced view of unscheduled meetings than I previously held. There is one last thing I want in this record. I have debated whether it belongs in a professional after-action account, and I have decided that if it does not belong here, it does not belong anywhere, and I think it belongs somewhere. I went back and read the original dispatch filing on the morning I finished the after-action report. Not to verify anything, the record was complete, but because I had been thinking about Saveth's question, the 9th paragraph of her reply, and I wanted to read what I had actually done at 317 without the 6 months of outcome knowledge that makes it easy to construct a narrative of intention where there was none. The dispatch was 3 lines: signal received, translation flag logged, site position computed, drone dispatched under standard collision hazard protocol, priority non-emergency. Timestamp 317. Processing time 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I had gone back to my coffee. I had not thought about it between then and when the drone returned. That is the truth of it, and I include it because the truth of it is important. There was no moment of decision that deserves to be called a decision. There was a protocol, and I followed it, and the drone went out, and 6 months later 6 people were alive who might not have been. I do not know how to characterize that chain of events in a way that is both honest and morally coherent, and I have stopped trying to find a characterization that satisfies me on both counts simultaneously. What I know is what Saveth said about the word care. She said the drone was methodical, and she said the word she wanted for it was care, and she said she did not think these were contradictory observations. She said the methodology and the care had felt like the same thing. I think she was right. I think the methodology and the care are the same thing, and I think they have been the same thing since the drone was built, since the humanitarian protocol was written, since the medical kit was packed and the relay module was loaded into the secondary storage bay by someone who hoped it would never be needed. Every person who designed any part of what the drone did had made a decision, at some point, about what to put in and what to leave out, and they had made those decisions carefully, and the care they had taken had expressed itself when it was needed, in a dead Hulk 43 light months from Ledge 9, to 6 people who were counting seconds. We did not aim any of it at Saveth Kelm. We did not know she was there. We dispatched a machine to check on a wreck because a beacon fired after 214 years and landed on a frequency we were still monitoring because an oversight committee had not gotten around to its agenda. The drone found someone. I am Maren Doss, Duty Communications Officer, Frontier Monitoring Station Ledge 9, Terran Commonwealth Survey Authority. This report is filed for the record on the 17th of September, all attachments included. The spectrum sweep is active. The decommission review remains pending. If the committee ever schedules the meeting, I will attend it. I will have something to say.